Hello, everyone, and welcome to the next Re-Phew Consulting workshop as part of a six-part workshop series around research and methodology. This workshop is going to be about or an overview on using social media in research, uh, and there will be um, uh, a few main objectives around this workshop, which will include use of social media in research. Sort of the things, some of the main areas of uh, sort of the main areas of uh, focuses areas and focuses that are aligned to ensuring that the use of social media is above board in context of research, albeit whether in whether whether in from an industry perspective or an academic perspective. The next objective is going to be about to understand the importance of integrating an ethical approach to use of around social media in research. And then the third and final objective around this workshop will be to acknowledge the importance of confidentiality, anonymity, and authenticity of applying social media in research. Um, so these are these points are going to be the main focuses, as well as by the end of this workshop, hopefully, those who are checking out this Re-Phew Consulting workshop can get a grasp on. So a bit of introduction initially. So this workshop is designed to inform researchers, investigators, whether novice or experts, etc., and to inform researchers, etc., and sort of even those who kind of sit on who sit on or focus around around th thing focus around where they are part of ethics committees or members about some of the potential ethical implications arising from use of social media in research. So that's one of around this, some things to consider, but also the sort of the advantages and disadvantages that around this around this around this sort of area in context of healthcare as well. And then for the purposes of this workshop, a broad definition of social media will be highlighted, and encompassing a range of different platform and network examples. And then the term social media is sort of an umbrella terminology that covers a broad range of internet and web-based sites and services that connect individuals and groups from uh, on the one hand, organizations, and on the other hand, as again, uh, connecting sort of individuals, sort of ensuring that areas of work, and for example, are sort of profiled in a way that is appropriate as well. So this is a bit of introduction there. So uh, let's go into aspects that focus around social media and research. Then, what does this all what does this all mean? So the rapidly growing use of social media has contributed to a changing cultural mindset for researchers and investigators, and it's become more obvious in areas of academia, and of course in different areas of industry. But in academia, where investigators or researchers, academics, students, young professionals, at different grades, for example, and different kinds of different areas of studies, areas of investigations, etc. Use use social media in lots of different ways. But from a social media stance, there is sort of sort of main streamlined practices that sort of come in part and parcel of how social media should be implemented as part of the research, as part of the research etiquette. So in this context also, investigators, let's say for example, one of the points I should have highlighted actually as part of the introduction is that where you have researchers, for example, or investigators looking at areas of healthcare, let's say, or looking to develop areas of healthcare, or even sort of get perspectives around areas of healthcare. The researchers and investigators themselves, let's say whether let's say for example, they're doing there's those students at undergraduate level or postgrad level, for example, and they're looking to get understanding around a research question or around aims or objectives according to a particular theme of healthcare, and for example want those people who have particular areas, particular sort of healthcare concerns, then the investigators themselves should want to should want to and also look to involve themselves and kind of immerse themselves in getting the experiences from those who are going through particular healthcare concerns, etc. Now, there are, for example, in this in this sort of day and age, there's lots of different sort of social media groups that focus around different areas of healthcare, and for example, those around certain long-term health conditions, for example. Now, if an investigator or researcher is looking to not just sort of gauge and get an understanding around different areas of healthcare, then or around a particular area of healthcare, let's say, or a health concern, then what should happen is that in order to develop an area or research topic, then those investigators should want to interact amongst those sort of social media platforms, as long as those social media platforms themselves are also moderated, are moderated and carefully sort of coordinated, wherein there are sort of moderators or administrators around those particular social media platforms. In some contexts, um, uh, just a little bit of backdrop on this point is that basically there are investigators and researchers that look to collect data involving those with particular healthcare conditions, etc., by recruiting those people or a number of people in areas of in and around a particular group or organization, but also around in aligning to a particular research questions or aims and objectives. But what tends to happen is that you get these investigators who look to get some understanding, but through, for example, apart from trying to gauge or understand issues around a particular topic, what happens is that they don't actually sort of interact on these social media platforms, and that in some contexts actually leads to a kind of a poor understanding or poor data collection in part of the research that some investigators sort of embark on. So uh, so this leads on to the next point on this particular slide on social media and research. So the key feature of social media research is that it should connect individuals and involves interactions both within either a social media platform or a website, or another interface. It's with those who are a part of that, and those who are sort of investigating around the topic, or are visitors, or even, for example, maybe undergraduate or postgraduate researchers or investigators, or even more experienced, for example, because really and truly, if they want to try to solve an issue or understand an issue, for example, then it only makes sense that they get some of that understanding by communicating or interacting on those particular social media platforms. And again, as long as those social media platforms, for example, are moderated and have good administration through them. Now, the next point on this is also interaction can be concurrent. Example through text, voice, video link, which can be synchronous, or the interaction can take place sort of at different times. Example, by email, which is sort of asynchronous, and it may involve public and or private interaction, or between individuals and groups, using mediums such as Facebook or Twitter or Instagram, for example, and raising issues around a particular, in this context, around particular health issue or concern, to address particular research questions, aims, or objectives, and also to help raise issues as to such as whether an exchange could or whether interaction or understanding might then become available to others with that particular health concern through through number one, in some context, the dissemination of the research after it's gone through completion, let's say, but also available to others through the retention of data. And what that means is basically where researchers should, apart from ensuring there is sort of ensuring that they are following appropriate sort of data collection guidance, as well as data collection areas of data protection. For example, we'll talk a little bit about this in the coming slides relating to for example, GDPR, the General Data Protection Regulation Act, which has replaced the Data Protection Act from 1998, and whereas the GDPR has come into effect from 2018. So in this context, it's important for people to know, for those listening in on this particular workshop, to get an understanding of the basis of the kind of main focuses around social media in research, in terms in context of connectivity, but also but also interaction by the use of social media, sort of the advantages and disadvantages as well. So I'm not gonna just focus a little bit on the social media landscape. Now, those listening in will know that at least from 2010 or 2012 and 2015, between those two sort of time points, the social media landscape grew from some of the basic social media platforms into more extensive social media platforms. So, for example, where there were for example, basic social media websites that still exist, for example, Facebook, but also like for example, Twitter and Instagram. There are also other ones that have come out that have since been adopted by different users in different ways. For example, Snapchat and other platforms. The social media landscape has generally allowed researchers and investigators to get understanding around different areas and focuses around that pertain to healthcare, for example. But from an ethical standpoint, researchers and investigators are still sort of still not at least in some contexts not using the capacity to really get an understanding from around issues where things around certain areas around healthcare can be more sort of overlapped with more sort of positive understanding in and around sort of ensuring that healthcare aspects can be better approached as well. So the main points I want to make here are that the first point really is changes in social media landscape and technology mean that previous differences between function and use of platforms have become less distinct. The second point here is improvements to smartphones and a range of new smart devices also have changed the way or changed the ways that social media is accessed. And I've mentioned, for example, Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram, but also, for example, LinkedIn, and so on and so forth. The way some of these are accessed are quite swift. They're quite sort of agile in being able to connect as in some ways or another. And for example, there is also no longer a distinction between no distinction between desktop computers, laptops, tablets, smartphones, in and around and for different social media platforms. So whether you're at a desktop or you're at a smartphone or using a device, generally speaking, doesn't really matter, as long as, for example, the things that are to be shared or disseminated, or where, for example, where areas of healthcare are being sort of highlighted. Basically, an individual investigator or researcher could be in the field or could be just anywhere else, as long as the things that they want to share are accessible. And there are obviously lots of different cloud storage systems, for example, through Google, Google Drive, or other sort of cloud-based systems out there that actually can help investigators and researchers sort of share their sort of understanding around health, for example, again, around health aspects that are aligned to healthcare, that much more quicker. But again, from that particular stance, there's an academic perspective, and obviously there's an industry perspective. So understanding how this can be done, how it should be done in following appropriate sort of appropriate guidances and etc. Needs to be sort of understood sort of at grassroots levels. And so another point here I want to make is that that the social media landscape has also allowed implications for how data can be accessed. So there is an emergence of new transient or time limited social media sites, and I mentioned, for example, another one earlier, about for example, Snapchat, which poses new challenges and ethical issues for researchers, because, for example, there's lots of so there are a lot of studies or lots of investigations from where academics, researchers, and investigators looking at different areas around healthcare have recruited participants, for example, to get involved in aspects around certain aims and objectives against a particular research question or a topic, for example, through particular social media platforms. However, what still remains quite a challenge, or again a sort of an ethical issue for our researchers, is where, for example, if they for example recruit through I don't know, for example, through Snapchat or through WhatsApp, or through another sort of social media platform. In that context, is it safe? Is it moderated? Is it following appropriate practices, etc. And in works that have been published, researchers, investigators, for example, have highlighted sort of the advantages and disadvantages of that. But even though some of these social media platforms have existed for some time now, the depending on where investigators and researchers are, for example, where they are based, for example, whether they are, for example, if researchers are in the UK versus another part of Europe, or for example, in the United States, um, or in Canada, or for example, then the uh, then the way researchers um, look to collect data or um, uh, involve participants, um, there's a difference, because in some countries, the platforms or the social media platforms are used throughout the whole research process, whereas in some countries, or a couple of those countries, but in other countries, or some of those countries, for example, it might only be that, for example, Snapchat or WhatsApp are only used as part of the recruitment process, or at least, for example, part of the sort of involvement process in some contexts. And when it comes to a sort of documenting any analysis or results around a particular research topic, then the when highlighting aspects around, for example, the analysis and results, or even aspects of recruitment, it becomes restrictive, because the researchers or investigators, no matter how well, for example, they document that, the context, generally, from an ethical standpoint, depending again where the research is done, it could go for or against the researcher when it comes to a manuscript being peer reviewed, for example, peer review for publication. So in this context, the social media landscape is something that still causes some sort of problems for even the most experienced investigators. So a couple of the ethical sort of questions are, for example, research ethics committees do not make, whilst they do not make any judgment about the methodical advantages and disadvantages of sort of implementing social media, rather than more traditional sort of ways of collecting data, or implementing the data collection process, or even other aspects of the research process. There may be advantages of using social media as part or all of the projects, the research sort of methodology. However, that being said, ethics committees, within academic institutions, have a different sort of perspective. Not every academic institution has the same sort of perspective around the use of social media from an ethical standpoint, ethics committee standpoint. And so there can be advantages and disadvantages depending on how researchers is seeking to implement aspects of social media rather than, for example, traditional paper-based ways of collecting data um, uh, or um, uh, or involving participants. The other point here is that um, uh, whilst there may be benefits to using social media as part of or all of a research methodology as part of an effort to add context to a particular research question, for example, the another area and focus that needs to be understood or should be sort of explored sort of around the initial phases from investigators and researchers is to include accessibility, responsiveness, speed, cost, and efficiency around the different kinds of ways of collecting data. So these sort of factors need to be understood as well. And the disadvantages may arise around the lack of researcher control, and that's important because some research investigations have more than one lead. For example, there could be an academic lead, for example, and there could be a lead from an industrial from an industry perspective as well. So there could be in this context a lack of researcher control as well. And then there's the lack of face-to-face dynamics, which is another aspect. And then there's aspects around that relate to the exclusion and certain types of potential participants involved or excluded in particular research. So these are sort of the ethical questions that investigators and researchers should look to address or at least ensure that as part of for example, I mentioned in a previous Re-Phew consulting workshop, for example, that there are areas around where investigators or researchers, when they look to do an ethics application, they must factor in aspects that pertain to the aspects around data collection processes if they are seeking to do that through social media, or also looking to recruit participants, for example, through a particular social media platforms. So generally, again, research ethics committees do not make any particular judgment about the advantages and disadvantages about implementing social media from a methodology or a methodical standpoint, but it is absolutely important that investigators and researchers highlight the way that they seek to do anything, any data collection. If it's not data collection, if there is an aspect around social media, then it's absolutely important that investigators, whether from an academic standpoint or an industry standpoint, they when reporting, it's important to have context and understanding around the social media aspect, if that is something that investigators or researchers are going to be doing. And the final point on this particular slide is to say, from a research ethics perspective, there is no particular barrier to implementing social media in any kind of research sort of retrospectively or prospectively. But as with any application for ethics approval or ethical approval, what is important is that any ethical issues, again, are clearly recognized and addressed early on, so that if for example, when actually doing the sort of practical aspects of any research, research that as going through the research, there shouldn't be any hindrances or barriers. And if there are, then basically it's knowing that that those aspects were anticipated as part of the sort of the ethics application process when it comes to getting ethics approval. So it's very important to sort of recognize and address those issues early on. So I'm going to just highlight a few points around social media platforms. Just some main points here. So, for example, where is the research to take place? Where are the researchers based based or where are the investigators based uh, in context or in context to the participants who might be recruited, who might want to get involved. What IT facilities are investigators and participants using or are using, because, for example, there could be different editions, different editions or versions of particular social media platforms. For example, if looking to use, let's say, Twitter as part of around a research, looking to use Twitter around a particular research question, then, for example, a Twitter previous version to a Twitter the current version, there may be different tools or facilities on a more updated version of Twitter versus a previous version of Twitter, and the same can be said for other social media platforms, and that might cause barriers or hindrances um, as to how a researcher or investigator um, uh, is is using Twitter, for example, versus how a participant looks to use the Twitter as well. So that can be an issue, but it needs to be understood from the from early on that that everyone who is involved in a research in an area of research and for example, looking to address a particular research question, that everyone has the same version, and there is literature as well. For example, that where for example different Skype, for example, different Skype platforms or versions or editions have been have variances in the facilities they have on the social media on the social media platform. So in literature, there has been some documentation of how that has caused problems. Or at least, if not problems, aspects that are aligned to um, some potential barriers. So another point here is, where will any gathered where will where will any gathered data be stored? Because the data collection after it's been done, naturally it's important to ensure that the storage of that data collection is private, is confidential, and it's actually ensuring that when it comes to part of the process, that investigators and researchers have done all they can to ensure that there's rigor and integrity throughout, and storage is part of the privacy, confidentiality, and the secure nature of how that data should be. And generally, academics and researchers and investigators, part of sort of academic institutions, have sort of modalities as to how that should happen. And it's important that those listening on the workshop, or check out this workshop, kind of find out that quite early on as part of the research, as how research is done. And then how and when will collected data be destroyed? And normally it can range depending on which academic institution. For example, it can range from anything from 5 years to 10 years. For example, so it's important to understand and get that context from a sort of academic heads who can give an understanding around that. And then, are there any ethical considerations arising from choice and nature of a particular social media platform? So before implementing or having a social media platform as part of the construct of a particular research question, aims, or objectives, for example, it's understanding whether that social media platform will sort of will factor in sort of ways that the researcher investigator sort of considers the nature of how that platform has advantages or disadvantages, but ultimately that can be a social, for example, a social media platform that can add to, for example, people in context of healthcare, can add to, for example, people who have particular healthcare conditions, for example, can actually find that that can be that particular social media platform is more approachable versus others. So that adds into the context around the choice and nature in any research or investigators sort of report or write up. And then there's the context around, is the research using data already in the public domain, or social media data with restricted access? So generally speaking, if investigators are using data, or look to implement data that already exists in the public domain, or through a particular social media platform, then in that context there has to be as part of the process, the investigator has to look to get sort of the permission to use that data in aligning to a particular research question, if it's and also highlighting to what capacity that data is going to be used for. So it's important in any research project to make that known early on. And then also, unless all data is already in the public domain, informed consent will need to be obtained from research participants. And having said that, both whether research in some contexts, research whether whether participants are recruited as part of a new research project or an existing research project. Consent has to be gained from participants who where a research question looks to answer a particular area or focus around a particular area of healthcare, and then on another side, if a data has already been published and exists in the public domain. For example, there are various epidemiological studies, research that relate to meta-analysis or systematic reviews even, where there's data that exists in that context, then the researcher investigator has to get permission from those who hold that data. So, for example, if it's not through a social media platform, then then it must be from a registry organization. So, for example, around healthcare, there are organizations and there are organizations and organizations out there that do a lot of data collection from a quantitative perspective, and researchers are looking to add, for example, some quantitative or numerical data, for example, around some research that is sort of being done as part of research, academic research, for example, then the investigator needs to seek permission from those who hold epidemiological data from the organizations who hold that. So in that context, obviously, researchers do not need to get informed consent from research participants, but they do need to get informed consent from the organizations who hold that particular research data. Which then actually brings me on to this slide quite nicely, actually, which talks about consent a bit more. So establishing whether the data can reasonably be considered in the public domain. So there is some data, for example, that is published in the public domain or is in the public domain, but for all intents purposes can lead to sort of more misinformation than actually adding to research rigor or integrity. So so it's important to establish whether data can be used. And again, an example of this is, for example, when around particular health conditions, there are organizations out there that actually hold, for example, epidemiological studies or investigations. Now, if those are from organizations that are well established against and are in line with healthcare guidelines or frameworks, for example, then investigators and researchers looking to looking to um, uh, sort of get or access that particular data after getting consent, then they can be reassured that that data can be potentially implemented in a part of a research that an investigator looking to is implementing in a, for example, as part of an ethical as part of um, an ethics application process, for example. Um, uh, so it's important to be able to distinguish or understand there are data out there in the public domain that actually can be can cause more can be more can be harmful, especially if they're not sort of linked with um, uh, sort of organizations uh, in some contexts. Another point I want to make is that other than where this is the case, how are research participants to be made aware that they are involved in academic research? So from the offset, the investigator or researcher should make aware that they're doing research in accordance to a piece of academic an academic activity, or as part of something to do with industry, or whatever it might be. But either way, in a line to getting informed consent, it's important that the consent process has, for example, what I'll refer to as information sheets, a cover letter, a sort of a flyer that outlines the research in summary, and basically the by having those by having that, the researcher investigator can be confident that participants will be sort of well informed about that, and having yes, and so it's important to have uh, uh, participants sort of have for them to have that understanding. Another point I want to make is how will consent be obtained, and again, there's lots of sort of modalities for that for that to be reached. Again, another point is how will a participant information sheet be provided, and there's lots of ways that researchers can implement information sheets, consent forms, cover letters, and sort of a basic advertisement that outlines the outset of the research, and through, for example, social media, through websites, through a participating research site, for example, where participants can use or go to as part of their aspects that relate to an area of healthcare, for example. And another point I want to make here is how can participants withdraw from the research? And it's important for investigators to get not to be too intimidated by the fact that participants who initially are enthusiastic to get involved in research, that also that don't be sort of um, uh, surprised that research participants want to withdraw from an area of research and investigation, there is literature out there where research has been documented across different areas or different studies and investigations that that research that in the beginning there's a high intake of research participation, but then towards the end there may be research participants who dropped out of an investigation because some issues that they may have had. For example, another point I want to make is can contributions be removed and or returned to participants? And so, generally speaking, in an information sheet or participant information sheet, that would be highlighted, and whether contributions by getting involved, for example, is there an incentive or not, and if for example there was in the beginning, then towards the end they've decided to drop out because then the investigators or the researchers have decided that an incentive is no longer a viable option, for example, then something like having contributions removed needs to be highlighted in some way, or at least highlighted from a context where as part of the ethics application processes, whether there's a contribution element. But generally, from an academic standpoint, in some contexts, contributions or incentives should not be part of the research process. So it's important that academics and researchers who are doing academic research have some of that basis. And then the final point on this slide relating to consent is that if any of the above are impractical, then tacit consent can be assumed. So that means from the fact of the participation. So basically, for example, most participation information sheets, for example, require or participation information sheets along with consent forms require participants to tick a few boxes against particular questions, and also sign and date those consent forms to ensure that those are actually forms of informed consent. But there are times, for example, when participants cannot consent with where the investigator or researcher is where both or the research team or the participants are not in the same place or same time. So that means that what sort of a worst or a worst case scenario, let's say, is that the investigator sends the information to the participant, and they sort of fill in the appropriate aspects of the consent form after reading an information sheet, and then send that back to the research team or the investigator. So that's that's an example of tacit consent. So the fact so that in this context, the participants or looking to get involved in the research, they have a basis and facts about the research investigation in good time before sort of completing the consent form. So I'm now going to talk a little bit about the confidentiality aspects, and this is just a few questions that investigators or researchers should look to consider as part of their research, and that is can the identity or plural identities, physical or virtual, of research participants be kept confidential? Will it be possible to guarantee privacy? Another point is it possible to maintain a distinction between private and public spaces? And the next point is, how traceable is the data by non-researchers and non-participants? And then the fourth point here, are there any potential means of identification of individual participants by means of linking or disaggregation of publicly available data sets created by others? So all of these points have to be factored in as part of any ethics application against any kind of investigation or sort of research that takes place, and an investigator has to sort of ensure that this is factored in into particular sections of an ethics application. Then I want to just highlight a few points about anonymity and authenticity. So all reasonable efforts should be made to ensure the highest level of anonymity possible is maintained unless specific consent has been obtained for identifying information to be made public, for example. So obviously, again, anything that's in the public domain is in the public domain because those who have highlighted that they're okay with they're happy for that to be in the public domain is because that they've consented in that context. So however, that being said, where anonymity and authenticity is concerned, particular attention should be given to the following issues, and that's five main points here. Is interaction between participants possible outside the research setting? And this may skew the research and needs to be taken into account in the project design. So that's it. So anything that's done sort of outside the confines of a research question, for example, and in context related to aims and objectives, then that context needs to be highlighted in some way, so that the whatever the research question is focusing on, the investigator has highlighted that at some point there was discussions, for example, that were outside the research setting, and this shouldn't go against having research sort of misaligned with the aims of objectives, and in relating to for example, if the work is to be written, if the manuscript is meant to be is organized in a way for a peer review publication, it shouldn't go against having that work published, but the investigator should highlight these this context in some context, so that it actually stands to add rigor in and integrity. Another point here is that it might be possible for somebody to participate in research in order to identify other participants for contact outside that context. So that's the question. So might it be possible for somebody to participate in research in order to identify other participants for contact outside of that context? And yes, it is possible. So for example, let's say in a primitive way, let's say a researcher or investigator against a particular research topic is not getting sort of a maximized response, or maximized participation or recruitment around a particular research topic, then for those who are involved, for example, the researcher or investigator may ask, can ask, if they know anyone, that one of the participants or a couple of the participants or more or whatever, for example, can approach and ask them, do they know anyone else that might be intrigued by that particular research question, for example, and wouldn't mind getting involved. And so that's and doing things in that way are absolute have been documented. And again, as long as they're documented, then it's okay to, it's approachable to do that. So another question as part of this, or a sub question, is how can this be mitigated in the project design? So if for example the research question is one that is specific to an extent where let's say, for example, it's a completely new research question, it hasn't done before, and in this context, the investigator, the investigator or investigatory team of the researchers can and should look to identify participants, so that those who are involved or looking to get involved are happy to do so, that if there's other participants that want to get involved, that another perspective is that to ensure that there's no sort of no or very little conflicts of interest, then it's important that the researcher sort of approaches that in their own way, because having in some context the participants asking other participants can cause some sort of challenges as well. Another point I want to make here is can the identity and social characteristics, or characteristics, for example, age and gender, etc., of research participants be verified? Well, in this context, if it's research that requires a questionnaire or survey to be completed, then it might be that the investigator it might be that participants are requested to fill that information in as part of getting the data collection. But in other contexts, for example, what if for example a child lies about their age and pretends to be an adult? So in that context, if someone does lie about their age, there's nothing an investigator can do about that, only to say that, for example, there was this information, but we can't, I can't say, can't 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 really are not really able to sort of verify that that is part of the true a part of the true data collection process. So for example, if for example, there are in one of the previous Re-Phew consulting consulting workshops I mentioned, for example, that a little bit on sort of the quantitative data collection, and there are research projects out there, investigations out there that actually highlight that even for example, the best research question or questionnaire that aligns to a research question, for example, has a number of basic research questions or questions that should be answered or the investigator is looking to get answered, but it could well be that the participants just didn't want to complete all of that. And so generally speaking, in this context, it might be that only some of the questionnaire can be sort of validated after having a number of responses returned. Another point to make here on anonymity and authenticity is direct quotations should only be used where explicit consent has been obtained. So that's absolutely it's important to know that. And then the final point on this slide is how can the contribution of research participants be properly acknowledged. So contribution in relating to actual work that they've contributed to, then it's important that the lead investigator, and the research team, for example, acknowledge those who contributed or participated in the research, and that might be by way of, for example, as part of a manuscript that goes in for peer review publication. For example, it might be that in somewhere within the manuscript that the investigator or the research team, for example, highlight that they acknowledge a number of participants for contributing in helping to answer a particular research question, for example. So that's it's an so this is an important point, and in doing this also, it may be that the research investigators, the research investigator or investigatory team may even want to keep that anonymous or as well, and that might it might be important for authenticity reasons in that context as well. So a few points I want to make on protecting participants. So it's important to prevent any threats to privacy, identifying the risks, identifying any risks early. Researchers should take appropriate actions towards harm minimization, such as removing authors or co-authors' names and sort of the @tag in particular social media platforms. For example, paying attention to any particular vulnerable participants so that well-being is assured, and then factoring in data protection in ethics applications is absolutely important. Again, I mentioned how the Data Protection Act of 1998 has been replaced by the General Data Protection Regulation 2018. So in this context, it's important for investigators and research to kind of keep up to date with aspects around data protection, and then having the appropriate mechanisms in place to signpost, particularly those who might be vulnerable, those who are in some contexts probable or highly probable to drop out of a research investigation, for example, that the investigator is able to signpost people where participants where there may be potential hindrances, barriers, or challenges. So having an understanding around that is important. And then the slide here on research management, storage, security, and copyright. Just a few points I'm going to make on here on this particular focus, as much of this has been sort of highlighted previously. What are the implications of a research design for data storage and security? Does the research design comply with academic and or industry policy, or both? So that's a question to be considered as part of the application ethics application process. Do the data arrangements comply with the GDPR 2018 as of March 25th of March 2018 with the provisions of the General Data Protection regulations? And who owns, another point is, who owns the information collected for the research? Can owners of platforms retain the data? Is there a need to protect research findings, or are these intended to be publicly accessible? I.e., for example, there are epidemiological investigations or studies that actually are available in the public domain, and for those research findings, the organization has allowed that to be so, and as part of their process. But if an investigation, if an academic or researcher is looking to sort of supplement aspects of their research, then they should look to gain the appropriate consent to have that intact with a research question that is being investigated, for example. So can the researcher control the data and the dissemination of findings, or do they relinquish control at any stage? So that's another point. And is it appropriate that, for example, any conference presentations that conference presentations might be immediately disseminated through, for example, photo sharing and tweeting using conference hashtags? So again, there are conferences out there, or remits out there, for example, where for example, where people take, for example, look to take photos to share, etc., etc. But the remit of that conference might be that they're not allowed to post those, for example, and so it's important to for every conference remit, it's important to know about those, especially in relating to social media platforms, and how they can be sort of abused in some context. And that draws this Re-Phew consulting workshop on the use of social media in research to a close. There's a few references or further reading that those who are listening in on this workshop or checking out this workshop can look to get more information. So there's a report it's more of a practical and ethical guidance for investigators and researchers. It was published by the British Medical Association in 2011, and it's titled "Using Social Media: Practical and Ethical Guidance for Doctors and Medical Students." And this was a BMA publications from London, and it should be accessible online. There's a another sort of document available by Kaplan and Heinlein from 2010, titled "Users of the World Unite: The Challenges and Opportunities of Social Media," and it was published in Business Horizons, and I believe it's available online. There's a sort of another guide that's available for researchers, titled "Research Information Network," which was published in 2011. Social Media: A Guide for Researchers, and there is a list of guidelines out there that have been published by at least from in the UK. There's an organization called the National Institute of Health Research, or NIHR, and from 2014 they had a published guideline on how to use social media in research, and as a kind of a basis of looking to, for example, collect or even share data collection or research through social media. The NIHR sort of documentation framework or guideline is always a kind of a go-to document to kind of start off with in some ways. But yes, this slide sort of highlights a few guidelines, a few references that those people checking out this workshop can check out. So I want to end this there, and I'll say thank you for listening in. I hope this slide set around this workshop, this Re-Phew consulting workshop, has been helpful. Thank you for tuning in and listening in.